Few journalists face difficult interviews quite like Andrea Mitchell, NBC News chief Washington correspondent, chief foreign affairs correspondent, and host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports, which airs on MSNBC at noon Eastern every weekday. Give it up for Andrea, guys. As Rebecca was just saying, she joined NBC News in 1978 as a correspondent based in Washington, D.C., and went on to serve as chief White House correspondent, chief congressional correspondent, and a panelist on multiple presidential debates. This year, Mitchell marks 45 years of reporting for NBC News, where she's held the powerful to account. Take a look at her extraordinary career.
Here's Andrea Mitchell.
Andrea Mitchell, correspondent Andrea Mitchell.
Mistakes that were made at 3 Mile Island.
Andrea.
Would you consider taking some action to intervene?
Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and the Senate will all be on trial. The president's role in resolving the strike was highly unusual. Here in Tokyo, today from London, the Israeli soldiers are coming now. I am somewhere on the floor of this convention.
I love you, Andrea. You are indefatigable.
Live coverage ahead right here on Andrea Mitchell Reports. This is the bill on FARA, on lobbying, right?
Let's come in on the live picks.
All right, coming up on 1 minute.
We may have to break it any minute.
All right, here we go. In 5.
That
4,
wraps up
3,
the hour.
2,
Andrea Mitchell picks
1.
up with more news right now.
And trigger track mic, go.
In Gaza, mounting civilian casualties and a growing humanitarian crisis with scant supplies of water, food, or fuel. I'm simply trying to call the facts as we see them, as we know them at this time, sir. I am well familiar with the position
that's a good thing, because then you would know that what I've said.
I think I got the trait of talking back really as a kid, talking back to my parents, maybe. It was what one White House official, in classic understatement, called an extremely awkward moment. When I first covered the White House, I just was always asking questions.
Do you now agree, sir, that there won't be a joint session with Mr. Gorbachev, that Mr. Gorbachev will not appear before a joint session of Congress?
They have never formally asked for one.
I wanted to know. It's curiosity, and it's also not liking politicians who evade answers.
May I disagree with the premise of your question?
For the sake of argument, no.
The strategy to get called on at a press conference was always hard for me because I'm vertically challenged. I was never tall. I couldn't tower over the cameras. It was very hard to compete with the tall men. The men always got called on anyway. And so I would try to scoot under the camera and come up on the other side.
Why not tell your story? You said you wanted to tell your story.
Or try to stand on a chair was one strategy.
Yes, Andrea.
Mr. President, it has been reported that you believe...
To be seen is important. With Ronald Reagan, I started wearing red.
Why you won't cancel the January 17th intelligence findings?
He saw me every weekend when I was shouting questions to him when he went to and from the helicopter.
Mr. President, why did you say
I'll be back in just a minute.
So I wore red, and then everyone started wearing red, but it worked. I got called on.
Andrea, you said you had a follow-up and I cut you off. Did you?
That's very kind of you. I just wanted to ask you, since you said you didn't think that...
You're not there to be popular with the politicians. You're not their friend. You're there to find out what they're doing, if they're doing something wrong, hold them to account, and represent the people. So it isn't a popularity contest.
Can you assure us that Russia will not be able to move further in Ukraine?
You're representing the American people every time you walk through those gates. The average person cannot ask the president or the secretary of state a question. You're their representative, so you have to do the job. Ask what they want to know.
Why did he call Shimon Peres to thank him right after Benjamin Weir's release?
I think it's really important to study, learn your subject, know what a person is likely to answer before that person answers, know more about the subject than the person you're interviewing. I think a good interview is when you have an interesting subject, whether it's a politician or someone outside of government, a human interest story, and whether you are prepared and you ask smart questions, questions that perhaps they weren't ready to answer, and they give you an honest answer. What are the other consequences that China should have to take? I'm always nervous. I'm nervous because I want to do a good job. I want to make sure I remember all the things I've been studying. I don't know how the person's going to react. It's not bad to be nervous. That's normal. As long as the adrenaline can take over and the fact that you're prepared, you're ready, can calm you down, and you become engaged. If someone is not telling you the truth, and you know you've got the record, it is really your responsibility to fact check them in real time. Don't expect to finish an interview and then try to catch up. You have to just stop right there and call them out on it. A tough interview teaches you that you really have to be ready. You have to be prepared. And you don't know if it's going to go in a different direction. And sometimes it's really hard because the person you're interviewing is difficult and wants to keep you off balance. I do like to do things where I know I'm making a difference.
Why did you come here?
Recently, I was in Chad with refugees from a terrible civil war, and they had nothing, and the children were dying from malnutrition. So those are very difficult interviews. What do you say to someone who's sitting on the ground, has no shelter?
No food, no drinks.
How do you come up with the right questions?
What do you hope for?
We need peace.
Empathy and the fact that you're a human being and you have to relate to people can only carry you forward, because it's heartbreaking. I would tell any aspiring journalist to study, to read, to really learn a lot of different things. Don't over-specialize right away. Learn healthcare, learn about the economy, education, the crisis in our country. Just read everything and then listen. Listen during an interview, because you never know when someone will say something that's really important. Drop a clue or a hint, follow up. Don't be thinking about what your next question is. Just follow the flow of the interview, listen to what the person is saying, and that makes for the most dynamic interview.
Please give a big round of applause for the one and only Andrea Mitchell. Here she is.
Oh, I'm overwhelmed. Welcome to a tour of my hair colors.
Well, and your extraordinary career so far, and there's a lot more to go. Andrea, you have not only been a trailblazer, I think, for so many of us, for women, for journalists, you've also really set the standard, the gold standard, all of those benchmarks that you were laying out, all of those rules of the road. But take us back to the beginning, because as Rebecca was just laying out when we were here talking, in your first job, you were called a copy boy, and you worked the overnight shift. How'd you work your way up? How did you find that strength and that perseverance?
It's really interesting, and thank you, and it's so wonderful to be here. This is an amazing program, and I am so happy to see all of you. I've spent a lot of my time on college campuses over many decades, and you represent the best and the brightest. So it's very, very energizing for us at, our advanced stages, mine more than yours, to see the next generations coming up and to try to be part of that. And creating a link with all of you. It was really tough. Women couldn't be hired. People of color would not be hired in a major newsroom. And it was the third largest market then, Philadelphia. I was just out of school. I had been an intern there, and they were recruiting me for their management training program. And then when I said I wanted to be in the newsroom, they said, well, you can't be a news director. You can't be in news management. Women can't do that. You could go into advertising or public relations. And I said, well, I'm a writer. I've studied history and politics, and I want to be in news. And I've worked for my school paper, worked for my college radio station, and ended up running it. And they said, well, we're sorry. So I said, well, let me go into the newsroom. And they said, well, the only level job is an entry-level job, and we don't have women in that either. And I said, well, then let me work at night. Wow. And nobody will see me. And the job was being a copy boy, which was ripping the teletype paper, which was, we didn't have computers, of course. We didn't have cell phones. I mean, you think about the way we used to report. When we covered Ronald Reagan, we would go on the road, and especially after the assassination attempt, we would carry walkie-talkies, and our teams would go in advance and put radio repeaters at strategic locations along the planned route so that we had 3 or 4 correspondents at all times covering him at different locations. And without cell phones, we would just be on the walkie-talkies throughout that location.
Wow. It's just incredible, Andrea, your strength, your perseverance. You tell this story of pushing to cover 3 Mile Island and the disaster. I think a lot of people don't know this story, but they didn't want you to go because you were a woman. And you said, that's not a good enough argument. And it's that type of strength that you showed in those moments that got you to this moment.
I was the energy correspondent by then, and so I was the only person covering nuclear energy for NBC. I covered the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is here right outside Washington in Bethesda. So I said I should have been the first person there, and they kept sending people in every day, a different person, because no one knew in the first days how much radiation had been released into the atmosphere. So they didn't want any one correspondent to get overexposed. So they would every day send someone else in. And I said, by the end of the week, the first week, everyone who's gone has been a man. I'm the energy correspondent. You haven't sent me. And they said, well, the bureau chief said because he didn't want to affect my ability to have children. He put it in a different way, but and I told him that men were as affected in their reproductive organs. I'm cleaning this up.
I know, you're doing a good job. You're doing a good job. But it is extraordinary to think about those moments where you had to push just to be able to cover the story, Andrea.
And you'll still have to do that. I know everybody says everything's changed. In many ways, it hasn't. We have a brilliant woman covering the Pentagon. For a long time, women were not accepted at the Pentagon. Yeah. Actually, years and years ago, Katie Couric was our #2 Pentagon correspondent, but she was never the #1, the lead doing the big stories, because that was a man's job. Yeah. And now, all the big stories are being broken by our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kuby.
Yeah, she is doing an extraordinary job, Andrea. And one of the things that we saw in that video, and that anyone who studied your career knows, you have interviewed presidents. You have interviewed world leaders. You have also interviewed, as we saw there, the people impacted by the crisis in Chad. How do you create that arc?
I think fundamentally, that's the most important part of my career looking back. The time I spent in Haiti during the Civil War and afterwards, and after the earthquake, the times I've spent talking to people in Iraq and Afghanistan, the women and girls in Afghanistan. All the way back in 1998, I went in on a UN plane to Afghanistan when the Taliban were in charge. The UN ambassador, the late Bill Richardson, was going in, and he took me along and an AP reporter. And he was going in on the mission to try to get the head of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, to turn over Osama bin Laden, who was hiding there. This is 1998. So it was before the embassies were bombed by al-Qaeda, before the USS Cole was bombed in 2000, before 9/11. Yeah. And he refused. But while they were meeting, I went off and talked to people and went secretly to try to talk to some women and do a story for Nightly News about the women who were they were being stoned, they were or killed in the soccer stadium if they exposed any more of an ankle, or if they were found to be, they could not work, they could not hold jobs. I mean, it was really extreme rules. And those were the stories that really mattered to me.
Well, and you told them so beautifully and powerfully, Andrea. I want to get to audience questions, but before I do, speak for a moment, if you would, about this extraordinary moment that we are in. You have covered the Middle East for decades. You know this region better than almost anyone. How unprecedented is this crisis that we're in right now?
The importance of accurate reporting, especially in the so-called fog of war, could not be better explained than what's happened in the last 48 hours. This tragic bombing, immediately Hamas went out and said it came from Israel, which was a reasonable assumption, but it's an assumption. And the news media around the world carried it. And we were very careful about it, but the voices in the region, in the Arab world, the so-called street, were that it was Israel. Well, before 2 hours had elapsed, before the president boarded the plane, when he was in the motorcade, the Arab leaders, whether they believed it or not, and there was pushback finally from Israel, but Israel, to its credit in this case, took time enough to say that they were studying it. So they were late in responding. And they were checking. And they denied it, but their denial was not accepted for many, many reasons, including the history of these attacks. And so the U.S. took time to study it. And very quickly, the Arab leaders said they could not meet with the president, which was really terribly sad, because this trip was conceived, and I had done a lot of reporting on this, as a very equally balanced trip to go to Israel with a lot of trust built up and push back and say, you've got to limit the ground war. They won't acknowledge this publicly, but don't go all in. Remember what's happening. You're losing the moral high ground. Figure out ways. We'll help you with options. Define your goals. Are you really going to eliminate Hamas? And he said this publicly. This one thing. Remember the lessons of 9/11, when, from his point of view and the point of view of a lot of Americans in the 9/11 Commission, we went in and eliminated the existing civil society and the military structures without realizing we were dooming ourselves to 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we went in so big and we did not understand. The State Department had written a big manual on what to do, but it was ignored by the military and the White House. So don't make our mistakes. Think about this before you do it. Get the Hamas leaders whatever you need to do, but think about the civilian casualties. That was part of the messaging. But the other part was going to be to build something with the Arab leaders on getting humanitarian aid in. Egypt is critical. The Egyptian president was going to be there and all of that. And so it was terribly important to have both parts, but that was canceled. And I think we're going to pay a heavy price for their immediate response. There may be another meeting that is convened in Cairo and another way for the U.S. to participate.
And of course, we're going to hear from President Biden.
But the bottom line is give it a beat, wait. Lives are at stake here. And no matter what is eventually proved, if it is proved about who was responsible, it will never catch up with the public opinion. So the view is going to be in the world, the people who have been so terribly, treated for so many cycles of violence, and who are the real victims, they're victims on both sides. And just realize that you've got to not jump to conclusions or accept official versions too soon.
I think I hope if you take away one lesson today, it's that you want to make sure that your reporting is grounded in fact. You want to wait a beat to make sure what you're saying and what you're putting out there is accurate. It's such great advice and such an important perspective on this time that we are in. We do have an audience question. Speaking of advice, tell us who you are and your question, please.
Hello, good morning.
Good
My name is
morning.
Nanyu Ganesi, and I am a freshman at George Washington University studying journalism. First off, before I start, I just want to thank you for your unstoppable work, not just as a woman, but also as a journalist, for dedicating yourself to credibility and really taking steps to make sure that our community is informed and taken care of. So thank you so much, and to you, Kristen, as well.
That's
your amazing
beautiful.
work. It can be topped ever.
Thank you. Thank you for those beautiful comments. Thank you.
So moving on to the question, currently there's been a large debate concerning credibility as a journalist. Obviously, we've spoken about this in the past hour or so. You mentioned a statistic, maybe about 26% said that they trust the news media. But people of all political affiliations are attacking and accusing journalists of inserting their own biases and opinions. So my question is, how do you as a journalist ensure objectivity in your work, especially when it comes to data analysis and making sure that your data is not biased or your sources are not biased, and build credibility and establish rapport with the audience, especially as a woman? And as just a follow-up, specifically when it comes to stories concerning crime and maybe war, how do we make sure that we're not overgeneralizing or maybe framing it in a way that's easy for the audience to understand, but obscures really important details that could impact lives?
Well, your question makes me know the future of journalism is in good hands. We have an aspire, clearly someone who's going to be a great journalist one day. She came with a question and a beautiful follow-up. Andrea, I'll let you take both.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're so right, especially with the world of social media, with which I didn't have to deal for the early decades of my career. Because opinions get formulated and people are in their own niches. And contrary to the way we were raised with television news and radio news long before all of this, people are only watching or listening to or reading, confirming their own opinions, their own previous opinions or prejudices or beliefs. And it's, I think, the biggest problem that we face is in terms of information sharing in the society. First of all, we are often learning after the fact that a lot of what we're reading is influenced by foreign actors, Russia, for instance, in previous elections and future elections, potentially Russia, Iran, China, countries that have huge information and disinformation operations and propaganda information. So there's that we have to worry about. But also, confirmation bias is a big problem. So I think all of that, I think we also have to park your opinions at the door if you can. Realize that there's no real objectivity, because by deciding, today we had to decide what's the lead of my noon show. There's breaking news. Sidney Powell, one of the co-defendants in Georgia, has pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against her co-defendants. That is huge news. One of her co-defendants is the former president of the United States. We were planning to figure out whether to lead with the latest from Israel, given the president's speech tonight, and what's happening in Gaza. Is the aid getting in? Is it not getting in? Or with the latest on the speaker controversy, because they're convening at noon and we have to juggle and do reporting. Are they going to have a vote? Are they not going to have a vote? So at noon, it's a very busy time. We get interrupted a lot by breaking news. Now we had to figure that out, and we finally decided, until we know what's happening on the speaker front, we should really lead with Sidney Powell. So that means rewriting the show and reformulating it and making sure that we're not bringing any biases into this. Whatever you may think about Sidney Powell, the story is that a major co-defendant has agreed to testify. Whatever you think about Trump, Biden, or anything else, this is news. And you'll be covering stories as a journalist, powerful, emotional stories, war, crime in areas that crime with victims And in a case where you can't be objective, you have to go to your editor, your producer, and say, someone else needs to be assigned to this.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful question. Thank you. And thank you for your beautiful comments. And we do have, because Andrea does have a show at noon, we're going to have to let her go soon to get ready for it. But Andrea, we've got one more audience question out in Missouri with KOMU anchor Sarah Moyers. Hi again, Sarah.
Hi again. I am here coming to you live from a classroom on the University of Missouri campus, and I'm joined by one of our students, Andreas, and we're all have been students who have worked at our local NBC affiliate. So he has a question for you regarding that type of coverage.
Yeah, as a producer for an NBC affiliated station, do you have any tips for using the content we get from NBC News Channel to elevate our local coverage?
That's a great question, Andreas. I'm so glad you're working with our great affiliate there and going to just such a wonderful university. We've worked with many interns and correspondents and reporters from Missouri. I think you have to, you can talk to News Channel also if you have more facts that you need to, figure out what this piece is, because you're getting reporting from an outside source. It's within the NBC family, so you should know that we have extraordinary standards requirements. We have producers. If there's a piece of video from Gaza, we have people studying every bit of it, making sure it's not a previous war from a different area. We go through the forensics very carefully before we show any video and describe any video. So all of that has been vetted before it comes down from NBC, from any of our programs. But you can always reach back and find out more and do your own reporting. Check and find out what's happening in that area, and fact check it with yourself if you have any doubts.
Great advice, Andrea. And before we go, we're here with college students. We're here at NBCU Academy. Here at NBC, we say that there is an Andrea Mitchell Academy. I am a proud graduate of that school. I would not be sitting here if it were not for Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, just in a few seconds, if you can, talk about why mentorship has been so important to you. You're someone who hasn't just had an incredible career, but you've really reached out to the next generation and tried to bring the rest of us along with you. Why was that so important to you, Andrea?
Well, I had a few mentors. There was a news director here, an extraordinary man, actually at the CBS station when I first came here to work for a station owned by Katharine Graham, the Washington Post company, which was very appealing to me, post-Watergate, to be so interested in 1976 to come here from Philadelphia. But so I was in local news before I went to the network in 1978. But there were very few mentors. My bureau chief here at the time, they were all men, and there was such a lack of women. So when I was finally in a position to begin hiring some producers and researchers for myself and interns, if there was a qualified woman compared to a qualified man, I have to tell you that I just consciously or subconsciously looked for women to try to increase. Women's voices are just so important. Men were making decisions about reproductive issues for women without understanding what they were talking about when this was a big issue. When Nancy Reagan and Betty Ford first came out and talked about their breast cancer, women didn't talk about breast cancer then. You couldn't say on some television networks or in films, breast or breast cancer. So it was really important that there be more consciousness, sensibility about women's medical issues. So I just think it's always been important, and now we have so much more diversity in our newsroom, to look for diverse candidates and find people who are bright and excited to work, and you love to work with them. So maybe I didn't have enough mentors, and I just want to make sure that doesn't happen to succeeding generations.
Well,
but
you
were hardly a mentee. You were already a shining star.
That is not true. And my first day of work, I sat with Andrea Mitchell, and she gave me great advice then and every single day thereafter. And because of Andrea, we have a generation of incredible leaders across this news division. Michelle Perry, who's your executive producer, Libby Least, who's the SVP of the Today Show and Today platforms in New York, Catherine Chomiak, and the list goes on and on and on. Andrea, we love you. Thank you. You are amazing.
Love you back. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you for being with us today and for sharing your story and your knowledge with us again, Andrea, our audience. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today.